In the fall of 2021, a man named Earl Hutchins was doing what he had done every October for the past 31 years. He was on his family farm in Crockett County, Texas, a patch of dry red earth about 60 miles from the New Mexico border, turning soil in a field that had never given him anything but stubborn grass and disappointment. He was using a subsoil plow, the kind that cuts 3 feet down, trying to break up a hardpan layer that was killing his germination rates. And at roughly 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday, the plow snagged on something it shouldn't have been able to snag on. He stopped the tractor, he got down, and when he scraped away the dirt with his hands and then with a shovel, he found a hole. Not a sinkhole, not an erosion cavity, a hole with walls. Walls that had been deliberately cut, almost perfectly vertical, into the caliche and limestone beneath the topsoil. The hole was roughly 8 feet across, and when they finally measured it properly, 11 feet deep. And at the bottom of it, wrapped in layers of dried plant fiber and sealed under a thick crust of clay, were objects. 30 of them, arranged with a deliberateness that no one who saw them could pretend was accidental. Objects that had no business being in a West Texas field. Objects that archaeologists from 3 different universities would spend the next 14 months arguing about. Objects that have still not been fully published. Some of what you're about to hear is in the record. Some of it is from people who were there and asked me not to use their names. All of it is going to make you rethink what you know about who was moving across this continent and why, long before anyone wrote it down. Subscribe right now and stay with me through all 30. Because number 1 is the object that made a retired professor drive 14 hours through the night just to see it in person. Number 30 is the most ordinary object in the whole, and even it is not as ordinary as it looks. It was a grinding stone, a mano, about the size and weight of a large brick, made from basalt. Grinding stones are not unusual in the archaeological record of the Southwest and Plains regions. Indigenous peoples ground seeds, pigments, and dried plant matter for thousands of years, and the tools they used are found all across the landscape. What caught the attention of the archaeologist who cataloged this particular stone was the wear pattern. The face of the stone was worn in a way that suggested it had been used to grind something extremely fine, finer than corn or mesquite pods, the most common grinding tasks in this region. Chemical residue analysis on the stone's surface found traces of mineral pigments, specifically a compound consistent with ground azurite, a vivid blue copper mineral. Someone had been grinding blue paint, and the azurite itself is not local. The nearest natural deposits of azurite in any significant quantity are in Arizona and in northern Mexico. That grinding stone was already telling a story about distance and intention. Number 29 was a clay pipe, and clay pipes are also not uncommon in the American archaeological record. But this one was unusual in its construction. It was a platform pipe, meaning it had a flat base from which the bowl and stem rose at a right angle, a design associated primarily with the Hopewell culture of the Ohio River Valley, a culture that flourished between roughly 2,000 and 1,500 years ago, more than 1,000 miles from a West Texas farm. The pipe was undecorated, but it was made with considerable skill. The clay walls thin and even, the interior of the stem smooth and clear. It showed signs of use, the bowl darkened by repeated burning. Whoever smoked this pipe did so more than once, which means whoever carried it to this place in West Texas carried it as something they used, something functional and personal, not merely as an object of trade. The idea of a Hopewell-style pipe sitting in a sealed hole in Crockett County, Texas, is the kind of thing that makes archaeologists clear their throats and look at the ceiling. Number 28 was a bundle of dried plant material, partially intact despite the centuries. The conservators who unwrapped it found 3 distinct plant species, none of which are native to West Texas. The first was identified as a species of sage that grows in the Great Basin region of Nevada and Utah. The second was a variety of dried corn silk, not the corn itself but just the silk, which is used in certain traditional medicinal preparations. The third, and most surprising, was a fragment of what appears to be dried copal resin, a tree resin widely used as incense in Mesoamerican religious practice, burned in ceremonies from central Mexico all the way through Central America. Copal in a sealed cache in West Texas is a data point that is very difficult to explain through casual accident. Someone carried it there on purpose. Someone considered it worth preserving. Number 27 was a carved bone tube, about 5 inches long and half an inch in diameter, made from what osteological analysis identified as a bird bone, specifically a wing bone from a large raptor, most likely a golden eagle. The tube had been carefully smoothed on the outside, and both ends had been polished to a clean edge. Small incised lines, groups of 2 and 3, ran in a band around the tube near one end. The groupings, when counted, add up to 28, which one researcher immediately recognized as the number of days in a lunar cycle. Bone tubes of this type are documented across a wide range of North American indigenous traditions and have been interpreted as everything from musical instruments to ceremonial breath tubes to containers for sacred substances. What makes this one notable is the incised count and the precision of the workmanship. This was not a utilitarian object that happened to survive. It was made to mean something specific. Number 26 was a small ceramic bowl, intact, about 4 inches across, painted with geometric designs in red, black, and a faded white. The painting style, specifically the way the geometric elements were constructed, and the particular combination of colors, placed it squarely within the tradition of ancestral Puebloan ceramics from the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, the area where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. The ancestral Puebloans were building multi-story stone cities while most of the world wasn't watching, and their ceramics are among the most distinctive and recognizable in the North American archaeological record. Finding a piece in West Texas is not impossible. Trade between the Southwest and the Plains is well documented. But finding it sealed in a deliberate cache alongside 29 other objects from multiple cultural traditions is a different situation entirely. This bowl was chosen. It was brought. It was placed. Number 25 was a flat river stone covered in ochre handprints. Not one handprint, not two, but 7, overlapping slightly. All right hands, all appearing to belong to the same individual based on their size and proportion. The ochre was applied thickly enough that even after however many centuries of burial, it retained most of its vivid red-orange color. Ochre handprints are one of the oldest and most universal forms of human mark-making in the world. They appear in caves in Europe, in rock shelters in Australia, in canyon walls across the American Southwest. They are almost always interpreted as signatures, as presents, as the most elemental human statement. I was here. This stone had been carried into the hole. Someone had brought their own handprints underground and left them there in the dark. If you've been watching this channel, you know I don't editorialize too much, but that detail stayed with me for a long time after I first heard about it. Leave a comment right now and tell me what you think that means. I want to know what you think that gesture was for. Number 24 was a shell bead necklace, or what had been one, the cord long since decomposed, the beads lying in a loose cluster in the shape they had once formed. There were 44 beads, all made from marine shell. The specific species of shell was identified as Olivella, a small univalve that is found along both the Pacific and Gulf coasts of North America. Olivella shell beads are among the most widely traded objects in the pre-Columbian archaeological record of the continent, found everywhere from British Columbia to Florida to the interior of Texas. But the manufacturing technique on these particular beads, the specific way the holes had been drilled and the edges ground, matched most closely to production methods associated with coastal California, specifically the Channel Islands, where shell bead production was a major economic activity for thousands of years. These beads may have traveled from the California coast to West Texas, passing through trade networks that connected cultures across nearly 1,000 miles of varied terrain. Number 23 was a piece of worked turquoise, not a bead or an inlay, but a raw worked chunk about the size of a large grape, partially shaped, as if someone had been in the process of cutting it into a specific form and stopped. The turquoise is a vivid sky blue, and isotopic analysis matched it to the Cerrillos Hills mines near Santa Fe, New Mexico, which were one of the most important turquoise sources in pre-Columbian North America, supplying material to cultures from the ancestral Puebloans to the Aztecs. Unfinished turquoise in a sealed cache is an interesting object. It suggests either that the cache was assembled in a hurry before the object was complete, or that the unfinished state was itself intentional. The object preserved at a particular moment in its transformation. For some reason we don't know, turquoise in this tradition carried meaning beyond its material value. It was sky made solid. It was life. The fact that it was partially worked and still carried suggests someone was in the middle of making something sacred when they decided to hide it. Number 22 was a wooden figurine, and its survival is almost miraculous. Wood almost never survives in the archaeological record unless conditions are extremely dry or extremely wet, and a sealed clay-lined pit in the arid West Texas subsurface apparently provided enough protection that this figure, roughly 9 inches tall, survived in recognizable condition. It depicts a standing human form, with arms at its sides and an elongated head. The elongation is deliberate. It's not a distortion of carving. The proportions are consistent across the figure, and the head shape matches a style of deliberate cranial modification, known to have been practiced by several pre-Columbian cultures in both North and South America. The figure is carved from a wood that the dendrochronologists identified as juniper, a species native to the region, which suggests it was carved locally by someone who then added it to the cache. Someone in West Texas carved a figure depicting, or commemorating, a person with a modified skull. Number 21 was a polished stone mirror, which is exactly what it sounds like. A flat piece of a highly reflective mineral, in this case a type of pyrite called iron pyrite or fool's gold, carefully ground and polished to a surface smooth enough to reflect a recognizable image. Pyrite mirrors are documented in Mesoamerican cultures, particularly among the Olmec and later the Aztecs, where they were used by priests and diviners for what the historical sources describe as seeing visions, observing the spirit world, or receiving guidance from supernatural sources. They are not common finds in the American Southwest and are virtually unheard of in West Texas. The surface of this one showed traces of red pigment around the edges, as if it had been framed or decorated in a way that the organic frame has since disintegrated. The reflective surface itself was intact enough that one of the archaeologists described seeing her own face in it when she held it up to the light in the field. Number 20 was a collection of seeds, 112 of them by the final count, stored in a small pouch that had mostly decomposed but left its impression in the clay that surrounded it. The seeds were of multiple species, not a single crop cache, but a deliberate assortment. Botanical analysis identified maize, the domesticated corn of pre-Columbian America, along with squash seeds, bean seeds, and seeds of 3 additional species, including one that the botanist identified tentatively as a variety of chili pepper, and another as a plant used medicinally by several Southwest indigenous traditions for its anti-inflammatory properties. This was a seed library. Someone had gathered, sorted, curated, and preserved a collection of important plants, the agricultural and medical toolkit of a person or a community, and sealed it in the ground. The question of who they were preserving it for, or what they feared might happen to the knowledge those seeds represented, is one that does not have an answer. Number 19 was a length of woven textile, about 14 inches by 8 inches, that survived in surprisingly good condition thanks to the dry clay environment. The fiber was identified as cotton, Gossypium hirsutum, the same species domesticated in Mexico and later widely grown across the Southwest. But it was the weaving technique that caught the specialist's attention. The textile was woven in a pattern called a twill, a diagonal interlacing structure that requires a specific loom setup and considerable skill to execute. The particular variety of twill and the thread count of this piece matched most closely to textiles from Casas Grandes, also known as Paquimé, a large pre-Columbian city in the Mexican state of Chihuahua that was, between roughly 1200 and 1450 CE, one of the most important trade and ceremonial centers in the northern Southwest. Casas Grandes was a city of 2,400 rooms and thousands of residents, a place with macaw breeding facilities and copper bells and turquoise workshops, connected by trade networks to both the American Southwest and to central Mexico. A piece of its textile tradition ended up in a hole in West Texas. Number 18 was a set of copper bells, 4 of them, small and intact, each about an inch tall, cast in the form of a small sphere with a loose pellet inside that produces a clear ringing tone when shaken. Copper bells of this type are one of the most distinctive trade items in the pre-Columbian southwestern plains, manufactured primarily in western Mexico and distributed north through trade networks that reached as far as the Mississippi Valley. Finding them at Casas Grandes, at Chaco Canyon, at Cahokia, all major pre-Columbian centers, is well documented. Finding them in a sealed hole on a private farm in Crockett County, Texas, is a data point that archaeologists are still arguing about. The bells rang clearly when the archaeologists found them. One of the people present described the sound as the strangest thing they had experienced on a dig. 800 years in a hole in the ground, and they still rang. Comment below right now and tell me what you would have done if you'd been the first person to hear those bells ring in the middle of a Texas field in the 21st century. I read every single comment. Number 17 was a flat sandstone tablet covered in incised symbols about the size of a hardcover book. The symbols were arranged in rows and included geometric shapes, spirals, footprints, and what appear to be stylized animal figures including a snake, a bird, and an insect that one researcher interpreted as a dragonfly. The overall composition bears some resemblance to the rock art traditions of the Pecos River style, a distinctive form of pictorial art found in the lower Pecos region of southwest Texas, though the execution is different enough that no specialist has been willing to call it a match. The tablet includes one element that resists classification entirely: a series of concentric circles with a straight line extending from the center to the outside edge, a symbol that appears in multiple ancient traditions across the world and has been interpreted as everything from a solar calendar marker to a map to a pure geometric abstraction. On this tablet, it appears 3 times, at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of the incised sequence, which suggests it functions as something like punctuation, or perhaps as a repeated declaration. Number 16 was a human figurine made from fired clay, about 6 inches tall, depicting a female figure with exaggerated hips and a stylized but recognizable face. The style of the figure, its proportions, the way the face was rendered, the specific treatment of the hair, matched most closely to figurine traditions from the Gulf Coast of Mexico, specifically the region around what is now Veracruz, where clay figurines of similar form have been found at sites associated with the classic Veracruz culture, a civilization contemporary with the Teotihuacan era. What is a Gulf Coast Mexican figurine doing in West Texas? The most straightforward answer is trade, and long-distance trade in prestige objects is well documented in this period. But a figurine is a different kind of object from a copper bell or a turquoise bead. Figurines, especially female figurines, tend to be associated with fertility, ceremony, and household religion. Someone carried this object from the Gulf of Mexico, more than 500 miles, and considered it worth preserving underground. Number 15 was a carved antler tool that the zoo archaeologist identified as a pressure flaker, the implement used to fine-tune the edges of stone tools, removing tiny flakes to sharpen and shape the cutting edge. This is a working tool, a craftsman's instrument. The antler came from a white-tailed deer, native to the region, and the tool showed clear evidence of heavy use. The interesting thing is what was still embedded in one end of it. Lodged in the tip, where the antler had been worked to a fine point, were microscopic flakes of a distinctive dark volcanic glass. The flakes were too small to identify definitively, but their refractive index was consistent with obsidian from the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico, a major obsidian source used by Southwest cultures for millennia. This tool was used to work obsidian from New Mexico. The person who owned it, who used it until it wore down, who placed it in a sealed hole in Texas, was a stoneworker with access to Jemez obsidian. They worked with their hands and they were good at it. Number 14 was a ceramic effigy vessel shaped like a fish. It was about 7 inches long, intact except for a small chip at the base, and it was painted in the same red-on-buff style associated with Hohokam pottery from the Phoenix Basin area of central Arizona. The Hohokam were master irrigators who built hundreds of miles of canals to water their desert fields, and their pottery tradition is one of the most recognizable in the American Southwest. A Hohokam fish effigy in West Texas could be a trade item, a gift, a marker of alliance, or the personal possession of someone who had come a long way from home. The fish was painted with enough detail that the species can be tentatively identified as a catfish, a bottom dweller found in rivers throughout the region. Someone painted a catfish on a pot in Arizona, or in the style learned in Arizona, and that pot traveled to Texas and went underground. Number 13 was a bundle of what turned out to be feathers, an extraordinary survival in the archaeological record. Feathers almost never last. The dry, sealed conditions of this particular pit were exceptional. The conservators identified the feathers as coming from at least 3 species: a macaw, a red-tailed hawk, and a great horned owl. The macaw feathers are the most significant. Scarlet macaws were imported live from Mesoamerica to the American Southwest during the pre-Columbian period, with Casas Grandes in Chihuahua operating the largest known macaw breeding facility in the region. The feathers of these birds carried enormous ceremonial significance and were traded and used across a vast geographic area. The presence of macaw feathers in this cache connects it to a trade network that extended from tropical Mexico to the northern deserts. Whoever assembled this collection had access to the most valued ceremonial materials of their world. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we are getting close to the objects that nobody wanted to talk about on the record. Number 12 was a star chart. That's what 2 astronomers called it when they examined photographs of the next object, a flat piece of smoothed limestone about 12 inches across, covered on one face with carefully pecked dots arranged in clusters. The clusters, when plotted and compared to star maps, corresponded to constellations visible from the latitude of West Texas in the winter months, specifically to the Pleiades, the Big Dipper, and the 3 stars of Orion's belt. The correspondence is close enough that one astronomer called it precise and the other called it suggestive, which gives you a sense of how contested these identifications tend to be. There is also a single large isolated dot in the upper right quadrant of the stone that doesn't correspond to any bright star and has been interpreted variously as a planet, a supernova remnant, or a location marker on what might be interpreted as a celestial map rather than a purely observational one. Someone looked at the winter sky above West Texas and recorded what they saw on stone. They put that record in a hole. They expected it to last. Number 11 was a calcite crystal, a single natural formation about 5 inches long, transparent and prismatic, the kind of object that splits white light into a spectrum when held at the right angle. Natural crystals of this quality are not especially rare in geological terms, but finding one in a sealed cultural cache makes it an intentional inclusion. Quartz and calcite crystals appear in the ceremonial and ritual contexts of a huge range of cultures worldwide, and their use in indigenous North American traditions is well documented. They were carried by healers, used in divination, placed with the dead, and kept as objects of concentrated power. The surface of this crystal showed a faint residue of red ochre, suggesting it had been handled repeatedly by someone whose hands were stained with pigment. A crystal marked with the hands of a person who worked with pigment, placed deliberately in a sealed cache alongside feathers and star charts, and ceramic fish and copper bells. The word that keeps suggesting itself is medicine bundle, and none of the archaeologists I spoke to argued with that description. Number 10 was a flat oval piece of shell, about 3 inches long, engraved on one face with a human hand. Not a handprint, not a pressed impression, but a carefully drawn representation of a hand, fingers spread, rendered in incised lines with a degree of naturalism that required skill and time to produce. The hand engraving appears to be in the southeastern ceremonial complex tradition, a widespread religious and artistic system shared across the eastern half of the continent from roughly 1,000 to 500 years ago. The same hand motif appears on shell gorgets from Tennessee and Alabama, on pottery from Mississippi, on copper plates from the Ohio Valley. Finding it here, on a shell in West Texas, extends the geographic reach of that symbolic vocabulary further west than most specialists expected. The shell itself was identified as from a freshwater mussel species native to the rivers of the eastern United States, not from anywhere near West Texas. The shell came from the east. The engraving came from a tradition centered in the east. This object traveled a long way before it went into the ground. Number 9 was a set of game pieces, or what the team interpreted as game pieces. 18 small flat discs, 9 made from light-colored limestone, and 9 from dark basalt, each about 1.5 inches in diameter, carefully shaped and smoothed so they could slide across a flat surface. The dimensions were remarkably consistent, each disc within 1 millimeter of the others in diameter and within 0.5 millimeter in thickness. Making 18 discs to this level of consistency required tools, patience, and measuring knowledge. Games involving opposing sets of counting pieces are documented across many pre-Columbian cultures, and various board games are known from the Southwest and the Plains. But the precision of these pieces points to something more systematic than casual recreation. These were made with care, they were kept together, they were sealed underground. Whether they were a game, a counting system, a divination tool, or something else entirely, they were significant enough to include in whatever this collection was for. Number 8 was a painted skull, an animal skull, a coyote based on the morphology, bleached white, and then painted across the entire surface in geometric designs using at least 4 colors: red, black, white, and a greenish blue that analysis identified as coming from a copper compound, possibly malachite. The designs covered both the exterior and the interior of the skull, the inside of the cranium painted as carefully as the outside, even though no one would be able to see that inner surface during use. Whoever painted this skull painted it completely, because it needed to be complete, because completeness mattered regardless of whether anyone could verify it. The designs on the exterior include a pattern that repeats on the forehead and along the cheekbones that specialists compared to geometric motifs from Mimbres pottery, a ceramic tradition from the Mimbres Valley in southwestern New Mexico, a tradition known for elaborate painted designs that often depicted animals, humans, and cosmological imagery with extraordinary detail and originality. Number 7 was a length of cordage unlike any the team had seen before. Not unlike in material or technique alone, but in scale. It was braided, 3-strand, about 3 feet long, made from a fiber identified as yucca, common to the region, in a technique that the textile specialist described as extremely complex, a braiding pattern that required tracking multiple elements simultaneously and would take a skilled maker considerable time to produce. At both ends of the cord, small objects had been tied in with the braid during the braiding process, incorporated structurally, rather than attached afterward. On one end, a single olivella shell bead. On the other end, a small piece of turquoise. These weren't additions. They were integral to the object from the moment of its making. Someone planned those inclusions, planned what the cord would contain from the beginning, and made the whole thing as a single unified object. That level of intention in a piece of cordage is not something you dismiss. Comment below right now and tell me whether you think these objects were placed here by one person or by multiple people over time. That question has not been settled. Number 6 was a ceramic vessel containing liquid. That sentence should not be possible, and yet it is what it is. The vessel was about the size of a large mug, sealed with a fitted clay stopper that had been luted in place with additional clay, and the seal was good enough that when it was opened under controlled conditions in a laboratory, the inside was not entirely dry. There was a residue, dark and waxy, that the chemist described as a reduced organic substance, meaning something that had been there in greater quantity and had partially evaporated and partially polymerized over centuries. The compound included plant resins, a compound consistent with cacao, and trace alkaloids consistent with members of the nightshade family, a plant group that includes both food crops and powerful psychoactive species used ceremonially in Mesoamerican traditions. Cacao in West Texas, in a sealed vessel. This object alone represents a trade connection to Mesoamerica that is not theoretical. It is chemical. It is in the residue. Number 5 was the object that started the hardest arguments. It was a rectangular piece of hammered copper, about 8 inches by 5, and on its surface, worked in repoussé from the back to create raised lines on the front, was an image. A human figure, standing, wearing elaborate headdress and clothing, carrying objects in both hands. None of that would be unusual in the context of Mississippian or Southwest metalwork. What was unusual was the figure's posture and the specific objects it was holding. The object in the right hand was elongated and had a pointed end, which could be interpreted as a weapon, a staff, or a scepter. The object in the left hand was circular with lines radiating from the center, an image that resembles a sun symbol found across multiple traditions. The figure stood on what appeared to be a serpent, its feet resting on the serpent's body. The serpent underfoot posture is a significant iconographic statement in several Mesoamerican traditions. The crossed interpretation of this figure, elements from multiple traditions combined in a single image, is either evidence of a hybrid cultural context or evidence of direct influence from a tradition where all those elements naturally coexisted. Number 4 was a stone tablet with writing on it. Not symbols, not geometric incisions, not pictographs. A tablet with what two linguists, independently, described as structured writing. Rows of signs, consistent internal spacing, clear left-to-right directionality, and variation in sign frequency consistent with a phonetic or syllabic writing system, rather than a logographic one. The writing system does not match any known script. It does not match the symbols on the sandstone tablet found earlier in the cache, meaning there may be two distinct writing systems represented in this single collection. One linguist, the one who asked not to be named, spent 3 days with high-resolution photographs before telling me that the sign inventory, the number of distinct signs, and the frequency distribution of their occurrence was most consistent with a syllabic system of somewhere between 50 and 80 signs. A syllabic writing system with 50 to 80 signs, carved on a stone tablet, buried in West Texas, with no known cultural context to place it in. She said it was the most disorienting thing she had encountered in 30 years of working with undeciphered scripts. Number 3 was a map. Specifically, it was a map carved in low relief on a piece of local limestone, about 15 inches by 10, showing a landscape with rivers, hills, and what appear to be location markers. The rivers are not labeled, obviously, but when the geographers overlaid the carved topography with satellite maps of the region, they found a plausible match to a stretch of the Pecos River and its tributaries running from southeastern New Mexico into southwest Texas. If the identification is correct, this map is accurate. Not approximately accurate, not suggestive. Accurate enough that a person using it today, with no other information, could follow the river system it depicts and arrive in the general area where the cache was found. The location markers, 5 of them, are distributed along the river routes in positions that may correspond to springs, to passes through elevated terrain, or to sites of cultural significance. The map is a document of how to get somewhere, or how to get from somewhere. It describes a journey. Someone mapped a journey and put the map in the hole at the end of it. Number 2 was a book. A collection of 44 folded pieces of treated animal hide, each about 6 inches by 8 inches, covered on both faces with writing in a dark pigment that has largely survived. The writing system appears to be the same one found on the stone tablet in Object 4, the unidentified syllabic script with 50 to 80 signs. The book is organized clearly into sections, with visual breaks between them and varying densities of text that suggest some sections are narrative or descriptive, and others are lists or formulaic sequences. The hide pages had been folded accordion style, and the entire bundle wrapped first in cotton textile, then in plant fiber cord, then sealed inside a fitted leather case that was then wrapped in clay. The preservation effort was extraordinary and systematic, as if whoever prepared this bundle knew exactly what conditions would threaten it and took specific steps to counter each one. 36 of the 44 pages contain legible markings. The decipherment effort is ongoing. No one has been willing to say publicly what they think it says, but the lead linguist told one colleague, in a remark that was passed on to me, that the level of grammatical complexity she could already infer from the sign patterns suggested this was not a simple record or a list. It was a sustained piece of communication. Someone had a lot to say, and they wanted it to survive. And now we come to number 1. This is the object that made a retired professor at the University of New Mexico, a man named Dr. James Calloway, who had spent 40 years studying pre-Columbian cultures of the American Southwest, get in his truck at 11 at night and drive 14 hours straight to a storage facility outside of San Angelo, Texas, to see it in person. Earl Hutchins, the farmer who found the hole, told me that when Dr. Calloway arrived the next morning, red-eyed and still in the clothes he'd been wearing when he left, the first thing he said when he saw the object was, "I owe somebody an apology." What Dr. Calloway saw was a carved stone head, about the size of a cantaloupe, made from a single piece of black basalt. Not a death mask, not a stylized representation. A portrait. The face is that of a specific person, rendered with a degree of naturalism that belongs to a tradition of skilled portraiture, not to a tradition of symbolic or schematic human representation. The features are detailed: pronounced cheekbones, a wide nose, deep-set eyes with carved pupils, lips slightly parted. The hair, or headdress, is carved in elaborate detail, the individual elements carefully differentiated. But what stopped Dr. Calloway, what had stopped everyone who saw it before him, and had either not said what they were thinking, or not had the vocabulary to say it precisely, was the expression. The face has an expression. Not a generic ritual solemnity, not a blank ceremonial mask. A specific, individuated human expression. The person depicted is looking slightly to the left, the brows arranged in something that reads, unmistakably, as concentration or alertness, the kind of expression you'd capture in a photograph of someone listening hard to something they hadn't expected to hear. Dr. Calloway, who had spent 4 decades studying the material culture of pre-Columbian America, said he owed somebody an apology because this face was evidence of a tradition of realistic human portraiture in pre-Columbian North America that he had, over his career, dismissed as absent, not undiscovered. Absent. The face in the basalt stone said otherwise. Here is what I want to leave you with. 30 objects in a hole on a West Texas farm, a grinding stone that had processed pigment from Arizona, a pipe from the Ohio Valley, feathers from macaws bred in Chihuahua, a map accurate enough to follow, a book in an unknown writing system wrapped in cotton and leather and clay, and a face carved in basalt by someone who had mastered something we weren't supposed to know existed here. The hole was not a burial. Nothing in it was human remains. The objects were not randomly accumulated. They were selected, organized, and sealed with the clear intention that they would last. Whoever put them there knew what they were doing and knew why. We don't. Not yet. Maybe the book will tell us if the linguists ever crack the script. Maybe one of the location markers on the map leads somewhere. Maybe there are other holes on other farms waiting for other subsoil plows to find them. What I know is that the world that left these objects behind was not small, not isolated, not primitive. It was connected, curious, skilled, and it was keeping records. Drop a comment right now and tell me which of these 30 objects you think matters most, and why. Share this with someone who thinks they already know the full story of this continent. They don't. Nobody does. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.